All right, so welcome everybody to this edition of our Master Naturalist Continuing Education series. Um, my name is Jacob Williams. This was a little bit different because normally the person hosting is not the presenter, but I am doing both this time because I wanted to talk about a topic that I kind of have a lot of interest in. That's forest farming. So, and I am the Union and Towns County ag agent as well. Let's let's get started. So kind of talk a little bit about like what is forest farming first. Um, this acronym NTFP, or sometimes people say C instead of P, that stands for non-timber forest products or forest crops. Is kind of what that means. And sometimes you might hear the phrase woodland botanicals. I'll be using that phrase some as well to kind of talk about these types of plants. Talk I'm gonna talk a little bit about why they are important because a lot of these plants that they are endangered or they're very rare to find just kind of in natural native populations out in the wild. And so kind of talking about how can we grow these things with the intent that we can conserve their populations by cultivating them. And today, when we talk about forest farming, talk about non-timber forest crops, um, so that can include a lot of different things. Today, I'm mostly going to be focusing on most herbaceous plants. So not really going to be talking much about, or at all, say about like mushrooms or about like sometimes maple syrup falls in that category as well. It's not really something we can do here in Georgia. But today, mostly focusing on herbaceous plants. I'm going to be talking a good bit about ginseng, um, but I'll be talking about some other plants out there as well. Um, so kind of the history of some of these plants to me, if you are a plant nerd, like I consider myself to be, the history of these plants is really pretty fascinating. Um, so a lot of these plants have been used for a long, long time for medicinal purposes. And I'm not really going to get into the medicinal side of these plants today. Just really talking more about how do we grow them. These plants have been around for a long time. They've been used for a long time by people for thousands of years. In the United States, kind of in the 1800s, the trade of these woodland botanical plants like ginseng, golden seal, plants like that, that trade really started to increase. And it's kind of interesting. In the early 1800s is kind of when it started. You think about people from history like Daniel Boone. He made a lot of money selling ginseng. They would float these bales of ginseng down the river. That's how much there was at that time. You would not find that much any out there in the wild anymore. But you know, there's lots of it, and so there was some trade going on there initially. Um, but it didn't really kind of start to take over the market until later in the 1800s. Um, and that's partly because there was still uh, a lot of people were still using kind of traditional European medicine and not these other plants. So that market really hadn't developed yet. Interesting thing is that in the 1860s, Civil War happened in the United States, and so the Confederacy started to turn to a lot of these medicinal plants because of the blockade that the Union was putting around the South. And so they couldn't get these traditional European medicines that they were used to using, so they started to kind of turn to some of these other plants because they could go out into the woods and find them and use them for medicinal purposes. And so kind of the Civil War kind of started to spark a renewed interest in these medicinal plants. And so after that, particularly in the South, uh, after the Civil War was over, these plants started to be harvested more and more. The economy in the South was, you know, after the Civil War was in ruins, was in shambles. So a lot of people turned to these plants like ginseng as a way to supplement their income. You know, for a lot of people, that was how they bought, you know, shoes. It was how they bought Christmas presents at Christmas time, that kind of thing. So really kind of became ingrained in the culture in some ways. So that harvesting became more and more common. kind of starting in the 1890s, those plants started to become more and more rare due to a couple of things. Overharvesting. There wasn't a ton of regulation at that time on the harvesting of these plants. Georgia was actually the second state in the United States to pass a law regulating the harvest of ginseng. West Virginia, I believe, was the first state. Georgia was the second state to pass a law and essentially create, and that was in the 1860s when they did that, but it was essentially creating a ginseng harvest season, which we still have today. And I'll kind of talk about that a little bit more later on. The other thing why those plants started to become more rare was the loss of habitat. These are plants that have to grow in shade. They have to grow in the woods. And so kind of in the 1890s, what we saw a lot of, and I live in Union and Towns counties where I work, live in Union County, so we have tons of national forests. If you went back to that time, a lot of those trees, a lot of those forests that we see today were gone. The mountains were bare, and so that habitat was gone as well. The trees had been logged. So that really put a hurt on the wild populations of these plants that we have.
That's scary.
And so then in the early kind of the early 1900s, people started to try to cultivate these things on private land as kind of to make up for the loss of them out in the wild. And so that kind of continued and throughout the years. And then kind of it's interesting to me at least, in Georgia, kind of in the mid 1990s, we saw a pretty serious decline in reported ginseng harvesting. And so it kind of leads me to think that in the 90s and up to the 90s, there was a lot of people who would grow ginseng and would report its harvesting. And then I think a lot of those folks who did that, they kind of started to die out. And that's never really been brought back. So with all this history, and I kind of have an interest in trying to bring some of these things back today. I say it is a lost art. I kind of do think it is growing plants. There is definitely a science to it, but with some of these things, especially like with ginseng, there is an art to it as well. It's some of these plants there. We've never, because they're so specific, so particular, we've never really gained mastery over these plants like we have some other ones. So we really have to kind of work with the plant to try to be able to harvest it. All right, so when we talk about these plants, and so I kind of mentioned that loss of habitat earlier, site selection is super, super, super important. Most of these plants that I'm talking about today, they're going to want to have some slope. That's going to help improve the runoff, so those plants don't stay wet, the wet feet as long. Most of them like a north-facing slope. North-facing slopes are going to be a little bit cooler and also kind of a mesic environment. Mesic means that it's kind of a moderate in terms of not too wet, not too dry, that kind of thing. That's generally speaking, that's what we're talking about. Another thing that's important or very beneficial for site selection is looking for what we would call indicator plants. And so these indicator plants, like if they're growing there, that gives us an idea that, hey, these other woodland botanical plants would grow there as well, because they have similar requirements. Hardwood trees is generally one thing that we're looking for. Pine forests tend to not do as well. That's kind of why some of these herbaceous plants tend to be more of a North Georgia thing versus a South Georgia, because we have more hardwood trees up here. And then you're looking for those indicator plants, those shade-loving plants in the understory. So, we're talking about things, and some of these things are rare, like hard to find sometimes, like Jack in the Pulpit or Christmas ferns, New York ferns, things like that. Maidenhair ferns. A lot of ferns sometimes can be a good sign. For ginseng specifically, they say kind of the ideal location is that you have a forest of poplar trees, tulip poplars, with Jack in the Pulpit underneath. Is for ginseng specifically, that's kind of the ideal situation that you're looking for. The other thing, besides those indicator plants, if you find golden seal growing out there, then that's an indicator, hey, golden seal, if I plant more, it will grow here too. So looking for indicator plants, maybe also looking for those plant species too. All right, so I'm going to talk some about ginseng and kind of get started off with ginseng. When we're talking about these woodland botanicals, ginseng tends to be the one that catches people's attention the most, I would say. And just, from the time that I've spent, walking through the woods, when you stumble across a patch of wild ginseng, that's a pretty magical feeling when you find something like that. There are some lookalikes out there. Virginia creeper would be one. Both of these pictures here that I've got on this slide, these are both ginseng. So this one on the right, you see it has 5 leaflets that make up one leaf. But when we're talking about ginseng, or if you're an old timer, you would call it sang, a leaf, it's called a prong. So this right here, this plant right here, it's kind of towards the bottom. This is a 1-pronged plant. Up here, this one, so we have 1, 2 prongs. So there's a 2-pronged plant. There's another 1-pronged plant over there. It's kind of a little hard to tell how many prongs these plants have from the angle I took this picture. But those are some wild ginseng plants that I have found. I won't tell you where they are, but I have found them in the Georgia mountains. This picture on the left, this is what you would call seedling ginseng. Oftentimes when you plant it from seed, when it first comes up, it has a 3-leaf prong instead of a 5-leaf prong. Sometimes it will do a 5-leaf prong, but most of the time it is a 3-leaf prong. And so that also can make it more confusing to identify if you're looking for it out in the woods, because it doesn't really look like the more mature plants that you'll find out there either. Generally speaking, so we have for ginseng, usually you would plant ginseng seed in the fall, usually kind of September through end of the year is generally when you would plant that seed. Ginseng seed, one thing that makes it really tricky is that it has to go through a period of stratification, which means that if we look at this plant over here on the right, if you kind of see those red dots, those are ginseng berries. They're nice bright red color, so that means they're ripe. Those seeds are ready to be planted. Those seeds, so there's going to be seeds in there. If you went and picked those berries and planted them in September, they're not going to come up in the spring. They're going to come up the following spring. So it takes about 18 months really from a planted seed before that will emerge as a ginseng plant. And then it would emerge, once it emerges, it would come up as one of these seedlings. And then the next year it would, if all things kind of go well, you would have a 1-prong, 5-leaflet, 1-prong plant. The next year you would have a 2-prong plant. And then the year after that, you would have a 3-prong plant. So it can take about 4 or 5 years before you get to a 3-prong plant. And generally ginseng will not reproduce seed until it gets to that 3 prongs. And then it can go on to 4 prongs. Most of the time they don't have more than 4 prongs on them. They tend to top out at 4 prongs. So that's also why that over harvesting can be a big deal. If people are harvesting plants that are too young and those plants haven't had a chance to produce seed to reproduce, that's really going to put a hurt on the population of ginseng out there. Ginseng is also from these plants, it's easily the most valuable by pound of these. You'll hear some crazy numbers talking about ginseng. If we're talking about wild ginseng, dried root, you could get anywhere from $500 to $1,100 per pound. Depends on the time of season and that kind of thing. So it is pretty valuable. And so that's one of the other reasons why people will harvest it so much. So there's several different ways to grow ginseng. The oldest kind of practice of it is what you would call wild harvesting. So that's going out into the woods, going out on public lands, finding a ginseng patch, harvesting, as much as you want to, and then going to a dealer and selling that ginseng. Historically, that is how ginseng has been harvested in Georgia and really in the United States. Nowadays, however, within the last few years, that is not legal anymore. If you're harvesting anything, not just ginseng, but even if you're taking a rock off of national forest land, really you're supposed to have a permit to do that. And the U.S. Forest Service in Georgia and North Carolina, from what I hear, is not giving out permits for that anymore. So that rules out national forest. And state managed land, you would need a permit from DNR. They're also not handing out permits for that at this time. And that's because those populations have gotten so low that they're not allowing people to go and harvest ginseng out from the wild. It's also kind of the simplest way because you don't have any input in there, right? You haven't really done anything to grow that ginseng. You're just kind of going and taking it. And so you've not really put anything into it when you do it that way. So another strategy for growing ginseng, and this picture is from North Carolina Extension. And this is kind of what I would call forest grown. And so you can see here, there are these swaths of ginseng that have been planted. This is going to require some more input on you. You're going to get a higher yield per acre off of this if you were to grow ginseng in this way. But you're also probably you're going to run into some more issues with disease management, possibly some pest management challenges as well. Just because these plants are so close, the leaves are touching, you're going to run into some more issues. It's going to require some more inputs from you as well, but your yield is going to be much, much greater. One drawback to that, if you're putting a lot of inputs, such as fertilizer, which the wild harvesting, there's no fertilizer being applied. If you're applying fertilizer, especially like nitrogen, that's going to cause those roots to grow much faster, and so those roots are going to develop much quicker. And I've got a picture later on that kind of shows you the difference between a ginseng root that has been cultivated, had lots of inputs put into it, and one that's wild. We'll kind of talk about the differences between those. So you'll get more yield per acre, but the value actually of that per pound will decrease. Wild simulated is the other one. So this is one that this is kind of a practice that I do. And really with this is that you're just really attempting to replicate how that ginseng would be growing in the wild. So you're going out looking for sites that look like a good place for ginseng to grow, and then planting the seed and essentially just kind of letting nature take its course. You might intervene some if you're having a lot of slug damage or you're having a lot of deer pressure on those plants, but you're really trying to let nature take its course and not putting very many inputs on there, zero if possible. And this is going to give you a more natural, wild-looking root on that ginseng plant. And this picture kind of shows you what I mean when I'm talking about tame, which would be a cultivated or a domesticated ginseng root. That's the one on the right. That picture, it's people say a slick root is what if you've ever heard someone talk about slick ginseng roots, that's what they're talking about. It's a tame root. It doesn't have all these little lines kind of through it. It's very slick. That root's going to probably, when we're talking about dollars, it's probably going to only have about 30% of the value of a wild looking root. So the value is significantly less, but you can grow a lot more of this. You can grow like on your yield per acre. You can grow it a lot faster than you could. These wild roots, if you're growing ginseng, really it's going to take probably at least 8 to 10 years of that plant growing before it would reach a harvestable size. So that's a long time to wait. There's a lot of things that can go wrong in 8 to 10 years. Deer can come in, people can come in and poach it. So disease could come in and ruin it. Droughts. There's a lot of things that can go wrong in 8 to 10 years versus this one on the right, a tame root. This is probably more like 4 or 5 year old root. So it's growing much faster, and that's why it doesn't have all those lines in it. That kind of wildness, people say, it kind of puts some more stress on the plant, which causes the root to look a bit more gnarly to it. And so that does affect its market value. All right, let's talk about golden seal. This is some of my golden seal that I've got growing. Golden seal is an endangered species. And so if you are growing golden seal to sell it, not if it's just for your garden, you are supposed to have a permit from CITES, CITES. You're supposed to have a permit from them if your intention is to sell it. Most of the time, golden seal is going to be propagated by rhizome. You can do it from seed, but the germination rates from seed tend to be low. So a lot of times you can buy rhizomes that people have split, and then once you kind of have your own population, you can kind of start to split your own rhizomes and in the spring and grow them out. A bonus, kind of a nice thing about golden seal is that it tends to be more deer resistant. And so deer can be a big problem with a lot of these plants. They like to come and munch on ginseng a lot. Golden seal, they tend to not, for some reason, they don't like to use it as well. Golden seal has a lot of medicinal uses. I've even heard of people making a wash with it and putting that on plants, kind of like as a natural fungicide and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of different ways that people use golden seal. Of the plants that I'm talking about today, golden seal probably has the most scientific evidence behind it supporting its medicinal use claims compared to like ginseng and black cohosh. Ginseng really does have kind of a more evidence supporting those medicinal use claims behind it. So it's going to produce little red fruits in the spring, which that's where the seeds are. And so again, you can spread it by seed if you have seed, but tends to be a little bit more tricky to do that. Golden seal is going to take 4 to 5 years of growing before you would harvest it. And all these plants that I'm talking about today, when I say harvest, the root is the valuable part of the plant. And so you have to kill the plant to harvest it. There are some initiatives to get people to try to use the leaves of some of these plants more, but really the market dollar is not there for the use of the leaves. People are looking for the roots, and so that tends to be what people tend to do. But golden seal is a great one to grow because it is more deer resistant, and makes it a little bit easier to grow. Black cohosh is another one. This has a similar appearance to blue cohosh. They're very closely related. I'll say black cohosh tends to be a bit more common in the wild than some of these other plants do. Black cohosh, the leaves are kind of a less rounded, a little bit more spiky shaped leaves compared to the blue cohosh. This one is not too difficult to grow, not quite as valuable as some of the other ones. I think that's why it's still a bit more common in the wild. And this is some black cohosh that I have growing that I planted from some rhizomes. Ramps are another popular one. These are less of a medicinal plant, and people really tend to eat these more. They can be pretty good. They can be pretty tasty if they're cooked right. But you don't need a lot of them because they have a very strong flavor to them. It's kind of like a wild leek, wild onion, wild garlic kind of flavor to it. Very strong flavor, a little bit spicy. It's got a little bit of a kick to it, especially if you're eating it raw. And so this one, you would harvest this one in the spring. These for the ramps, the leaves will emerge early in the spring, and so when those leaves emerge early in the spring, the trees haven't really started to put out all their leaves yet. So we kind of have some more of this dappled sunlight coming down to the ground. And so really generally like in May is when those plants would be harvested. And then in April is when they'd be harvested. By the end of May, those leaves are turning yellow and they're starting to wilt and die back. So once that starts to happen, these plants are about impossible to find. In the fall, they'll put up a seed head, and they'll produce some seed. That seed head It's about 18 inches off the ground, but it's kind of this dark brown black color, which can make it really hard to spot against, looking at against all the leaves, leaf litter on the ground can make those seeds really hard to spot. These they'll grow. It's a bulb plant, so so you can kind of split those bulbs and you can multiply them that way. There's a couple of lookalike plants for these ramps. Um, like a false hellebore would be one example of a lookalike. Showy orchis is another one that looks kind of similar, but the big difference between ramps and those other plants is that the ramps at the soil line kind of have this purplish, it's called a scape. And that's right where that stem emerges out of the ground. It's kind of has this reddish purplish color to it. So if you see that, you know that it is a ramp. Again, kind of they're a traditional part of Appalachian cuisine. So if you ever have an opportunity to try them, I would encourage you to do so. But you don't need a lot of them. a little bit of ramp goes a long way because they have a lot of flavor packed in there. I think because of that, because they are so strong, I think that makes them deer resistant. The deer tend to not eat ramps, just I think because that flavor is so strong. Ramps are going to like spots that are a little bit wetter soil compared to some of those other plants that I mentioned earlier. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these different types of plants. What are some challenges to growing these? Poaching is a big one, especially with ginseng and with ramps too, I would say. Depends on where you are, what part of the country you're in with ramps. But people coming and stealing them. Once people know that you have them there, there's people out there who will steal them. Wildlife damage for some of these can be a pretty big issue as well. Deer, for ginseng, they love to eat on those leaves, and that can be a huge problem. Generally, for older ginseng plants, a deer is not going to kill the plant. They're just going to eat back the leaves, and that could stunt the growth that season of that plant. But if it's a mature plant, it should be able to sprout back the next year. If it's a very young plant, like a first-year plant, if a deer bites on that leaf, it might rip the whole plant, the root and everything out of the ground, which obviously that would kill the plant. So that can be a problem. Because when we're talking about these plants, the value of them is in the root. That makes voles a very serious pest of them, because if you have chewed up roots, those they lose all their value. Nobody wants to buy roots that have been chewed through by a vole, or the root is entirely gone because of vole. Invertebrate damage like slugs. Slugs will, if you have a spot that's kind of maybe a little bit too wet, especially, slugs can get on there, and they can really do a serious number on eating the leaves of some of these plants too. It's kind of not something we would usually expect, but that can be a problem. And then disease can be an issue. Plant disease. This tends to be an issue if you just have plants that are planted too closely together, and those leaves are touching. Now we just have a great environment for disease to be exchanged. We don't have good airflow moving through, and so that's when we start to have disease problems with these plants. And for a lot of these plants, because they are not really commonly grown, there are fungicides out there that you can spray, but the list of fungicides and insecticides that are labeled for use on these plants is pretty limited, because these are not plants are just really not commonly grown. All right, so because some of these plants are rare, endangered, some of them, there are some kind of legalities around it if you are wanting to grow some. If your intent is to grow or especially to sell, you may need some permits to be able to do that. Like with ginseng, you are supposed to be registered to be able to sell ginseng, and you're only allowed to sell it to someone who is a registered dealer as well. DNR in our state maintains that list, so you can go and it's public information, so you can go and look up the list of who is a ginseng dealer, so who legally can buy ginseng. And it's kind of interesting, up here in the mountains, when it gets to September 1st, that's when the harvest season for ginseng opens. It's September 1st through December 31st is the legal harvest season. Also, you'll see signs, on like little road signs starting to pop up along the side of the road with, says, "We'll buy ginseng," and it'll have a phone number on there. People looking for someone who's, people who are harvesting ginseng and selling it. Um, and so that harvest season, especially for ginseng, that is something to keep in mind. For ginseng, like I said, September 1st through December 31st. And the intent behind that, I mentioned earlier that back in the 1860s, Georgia passed a law about that harvest season. And that's because generally by September 1st, ginseng berries are ripe. And so the seed that ginseng plant is producing is ripe. And so the idea is that, you have to, when you go and harvest a plant, whether it's on private or public land, and the only legal ginseng to harvest in Georgia is on private land, you have to bury that seed where you found it. So if you go and you have a patch, even if it's just for your personal use and you're harvesting it, you're supposed to collect any seed off of it, and you're not supposed to spread it around. You're really supposed to bury that seed right back where in the area where you found it. And so that's kind of why that harvest season is there. For ginseng, another law in Georgia for ginseng and most states, so that plant has to have at least 3 prongs on it to legally harvest it, to dig it up, because those plants that are less than 3 prongs, the idea is that those have not had an opportunity to get big enough to produce seed yet. So those plants need maybe a year or 2 more so that they can grow and reproduce. So we're not, and so really, if everyone followed the laws on harvesting ginseng, we would have tons of ginseng out there, because the law is designed to increase the population of ginseng that we have. All right, so can you grow these plants? Classic extension answer is yes, it depends. So, do you have an appropriate site would be kind of one of the main things I would be asking about. So, we talked about the shade, so do you have kind of a shady spot that stays a little bit cooler than the area than other areas? So, and for some of these things, like ginseng and golden seal, we can do, our lab at the University of Georgia does offer soil testing for ginseng and golden seal. So you could do a soil test as well. That's always a good practice, regardless of what you're planting. So there are some ways that you can kind of check that. Be looking for those indicator plants as well. That's going to give you an idea if you have an appropriate site where these things could grow. Another big question for can I grow these plants is where can I buy seed? This one can get a little bit tricky, where I can buy seed. I'll tell you, I've honestly had some good success with buying seed and buying rhizomes, like for golden seal and for black cohosh on Etsy. There's people selling it there, so you can buy from them online. I've also seen seed for sale, like sometimes Johnny's seeds. Places like that, they'll have some of these too, but usually the quantities for any of these is going to be pretty limited. So if you're looking to plant some of these, you might not be able to get a ton of seed. You might have to kind of start your own patch and grow them out, start producing your own seed, or start producing your own rhizomes, really, if you're trying to grow a bigger and bigger patch. I was going to mention this project. This is a project I've been working on for the last couple of years. The Reese Farm. It's a kind of like a park in Union County. It's a county-owned park. I've been working to try to plant some of these woodland botanical plants that I've mentioned today, so we can have a demonstration garden of them, so we can do some workshops on teaching people how to grow these types of things. Kind of encouraging that, as I mentioned at the beginning, that conservation through cultivation. The idea is that if we can teach people how to grow these things, then that's going to take pressure off of the wild populations that are out there. Also been working on doing a native orchard out at the Reese Farm. So I have things like persimmons, mulberry, pawpaw, kind of plants like that planted out there as well. Really, ultimately, kind of my goal with that Reese Farm project is to try to build a network of these forest farmers who are out there in Georgia, and try to kind of create some more resources so that we have some ways to help those people who are interested in those kinds of things. All right, I'm going to share a couple of books with you guys. Let's see, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here so that you can see. A couple of books that are some good resources. This one is called Ginseng Digger. This is by Dr. Luc Manger. He is a professor at Western Carolina University, used to be at Dalton State University here in Georgia. But this is about the history of ginseng. So if you're interested in that, this is a really good resource, good book to check out. If you're kind of just looking for a quick guide to how to grow some of these plants that I mentioned today and other ones as well, the Forest Farmer's Handbook is a really handy guide. It's not super long, but it's got a lot of kind of great information just to get you started on a lot of these plants. I believe the PDF version of this is free. Actually, if you go online, if you go to the Rural Action or the United Plant Savers website, you can find this book for free. If you want a hard copy, like I have here, then you do have to pay for that. But I believe the PDF version is free. And then I would say if you're really serious about growing some of these plants, this book is kind of is very well regarded amongst these woodland botanical farmers, these forest farmers, growing and marketing ginseng, golden seal, and other woodland medicinals. This is a really good book if you're kind of looking for more in-depth information on it. It's written by Janine Davis and Scott Persons. Janine Davis is a extension specialist in North Carolina with North Carolina State Extension, and she's kind of written a lot of things about growing these forest farming plants and that kind of thing. So this is, if you're looking for a lot of information, then I would say that this is kind of the route to go. So that is all the slides that I had to share with you. I'm happy to take any questions before I'm going to stop recording. So if you want to speak out loud and ask some questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.